The church bells echoed through the quiet morning as mourners gathered to pay their final respects. The air was still, filled with the scent of lilies and a somber silence that settled over the crowd. Among the black-clad guests stood Margaret, the grieving widow, holding a delicate handkerchief to her face as she dabbed at the tears slipping down her cheeks. She seemed to sway slightly, overcome by sorrow, or so it appeared. Not far from her, a figure lingered at the edge of the gathering. Helen, the wife of the deceased, watched the scene with a mixture of grief and something darker, something sharper. Her gaze was fixed on Margaret, watching each gesture, each tear with a growing sense of suspicion. The two women were there for the same man, but Helen's instincts whispered that Margaret's grief held a hidden truth. Helen's husband, Thomas, had lived a double life, and Margaret was the final piece of a puzzle Helen had tried for years to put together. As the funeral procession began, Helen's mind was racing, flashing back to unexplained weekends, odd behavior, and whispers she had ignored. Helen felt her chest tighten as her suspicions turned into conviction. Margaret hadn't simply been Thomas's friend or confidant. She was something far more intimate, something that turned Helen's grief into a knot of betrayal and fury. As the casket was lowered, Margaret approached with a rose in hand, whispering softly, almost as if speaking to the deceased in a way only lovers do. Helen's fingers clenched, the pressure building in her chest like an impending storm. She couldn't contain it any longer. She stepped forward, catching the attention of a few curious onlookers, her voice cold and unwavering. "Did you love him?" Helen's words sliced through the air, breaking the silence and drawing every eye toward her. Margaret froze, her face paling, the rose slipping from her hand as her gaze locked with Helen's. For a moment, neither woman moved. "That I in a low voice," Margaret replied. "I did." Helen felt a tremor of rage roll through her, her grief momentarily overshadowed by the weight of this admission. "So, how long?" she asked, her voice thick with the betrayal that was clawing its way to the surface. Margaret swallowed, her face hardening as she realized there was no use in hiding the truth any longer. "2 years," she whispered, just loud enough for Helen to hear. The revelation landed like a blow, not only to Helen but to the handful of mourners who stood close enough to overhear. The shock rippled through the small crowd, whispers breaking out among them. But Helen was far from finished. Her gaze was unyielding, her voice sharp and relentless as she continued her questioning, probing Margaret's fragile defenses. "Did he ever tell you about me? About our life together?" Helen's voice was tinged with bitterness, each word a reminder of the years she had spent by Thomas's side, oblivious to the life he was living behind her back. Margaret hesitated, glancing down as she replied, "He told me he was unhappy, that he was trapped." A gasp escaped Helen's lips as the rage threatened to spill over. But before she could utter another word, Margaret added, almost defiantly, "He loved me, Helen. He wanted to be with me. He said he'd leave you." The words hung in the air, each one like a shard of glass embedding itself deeper into Helen's heart. She fought to keep her composure, but the truth of Thomas's betrayal shattered her last remnants of restraint. The tension between the two women had become palpable, their pain and resentment laid bare for all to witness. As Helen opened her mouth to respond, her voice shook with barely contained fury. But before she could speak, the moment was broken by the sudden, chilling realization of what she wanted most in that moment: to make Margaret feel the pain she herself was enduring. Without warning, Helen took a step closer, her voice low but full of venom. "You think he loved you? He was a liar, a coward, and you fell for it, just like I did." Margaret's face twisted with a mixture of defiance and guilt, but she said nothing, simply standing there, shoulders slumped, as Helen's words tore into her. The service ended abruptly, leaving the two women standing alone by the grave, locked in a silent battle of emotions. As the last mourner left, Helen turned away, leaving Margaret to confront her own guilt amidst the growing shadows of the late afternoon. Helen walked away from the gravesite, her mind swirling with anger and disbelief. The weight of her husband's betrayal pressed on her chest, leaving her breathless. How could she have been so blind? The man she had loved, the man she had built a life with, had been living a lie. And now he was gone, taking his secrets with him to the grave, leaving her alone to confront the mess he had left behind. As Helen reached the edge of the cemetery, a hand gently touched her shoulder. She turned to see Margaret standing there, her face softened by grief and something else, guilt. "Helen," Margaret began, her voice trembling, "I never meant for you to find out this way. I didn't know you'd be here, and I didn't know it would end like this." Helen's eyes narrowed, her anger simmering beneath the surface. "You didn't know?" she scoffed. "You were with my husband for 2 years, and you didn't think it would come to this? You didn't think you'd eventually have to face me?" Margaret dropped her gaze, swallowing hard before answering. "I thought he'd make a choice, Helen. I thought he'd eventually decide between us, but he never did." Helen's laugh was bitter, hollow. "You thought he'd leave me for you? Margaret, he was never going to leave. He wanted everything. His marriage, his affair, his little secrets. And we were both too blinded by him to see it." Margaret's face twisted with a mix of shame and sadness, but she didn't look away. Instead, she stepped closer, her voice soft but steady. "You're right, I was foolish, but I loved him, Helen. And I think, in his own way, he loved me too." Helen clenched her jaw, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. The pain in her heart was unbearable, and hearing Margaret claim love for the man who had deceived her only made it worse. She wanted to lash out, to scream, but she held herself together, channeling her anger into cold resolve. "Love?" Helen repeated, her voice a whisper filled with venom. "Love doesn't look like this. Love doesn't leave a trail of lies and destruction. Whatever he felt for you, it wasn't love. It was selfishness, pure and simple." Margaret didn't respond, her silence speaking louder than words. She knew Helen was right, knew that Thomas's promises had been empty, but knowing didn't make the pain any less real, and as she looked at Helen, she realized that the two of them had become unwilling partners in this tragedy, both victims of a man's greed and deceit. The two women stood in silence, the weight of their shared sorrow hanging heavy between them. The cemetery was nearly empty now, save for a few lingering mourners paying their final respects. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and filling the quiet air with a soft, mournful sound. Finally, Margaret broke the silence, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry, Helen, for everything. If I could go back, if I could change things." Helen cut her off, her voice cold. "It's too late for that, Margaret. He's gone, and we're the ones left to pick up the pieces. Apologies won't fix this." Margaret nodded, her face etched with regret, but as she turned to leave, she paused, looking back at Helen with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "You know, we're not so different, you and I. We both loved a man who lied to us, who used us. Maybe, in some twisted way, that connects us." Helen's lips pressed into a thin line, her mind churning with conflicting emotions. She hated Margaret, despised her for the role she had played in her husband's betrayal, and yet she understood the woman standing before her better than anyone else. They were both victims, both pawns in a game they hadn't even realized was being played. Without another word, Margaret walked away, leaving Helen alone in the fading light. The sky was darkening, and the first drops of rain began to fall, soft and unrelenting, as if mourning alongside her. Helen stood there, staring at her husband's grave, feeling the rain soak through her clothes, chilling her to the bone. She didn't know how long she stood there, lost in thought, but when she finally turned to leave, a strange sense of calm settled over her. The anger hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something else, a steely resolve. This wasn't over. Not yet. In the days following the funeral, Helen couldn't shake the hollow ache that filled her heart. She moved through her days like a ghost, surrounded by reminders of the life she thought she'd shared with Thomas. But beneath the sadness, a dark resolve grew. She had to confront the truth of what Thomas had done, and that meant confronting Margaret one final time. Helen tracked Margaret down to a small house on the outskirts of town. It was a modest, unassuming place, the kind of home one would never associate with scandal. Helen took a deep breath, steadying herself before knocking on the door. After a pause, the door opened and Margaret stood there, her face shadowed with surprise and a trace of fear. "Helen, what are you doing here?" Margaret's voice was wary. "I think you know why I'm here," Helen replied, her tone even. "We have unfinished business. You took something from me, and I can't move forward until I get it back." Margaret's eyes widened, but she stepped aside, allowing Helen into the small living room. They sat across from each other, the tension between them thick and unyielding. For a moment, they simply stared, each one studying the other, two women bound by a shared pain neither could fully express. words. "He lied to both of us," Margaret began, her voice soft. "But I loved him, Helen. I really did." Helen shook her head, bitterness creeping into her words. "You say that, but love doesn't look like what you two had. You were just part of his game, a piece in a puzzle he constructed to feel powerful." Margaret's expression hardened. "You don't know what we shared. He was real with me in a way he probably never was with you." Helen felt a flash of anger, her fists clenching. "You think you knew him? He was my husband for 15 years, Margaret. We had a life, a family, things he never even told you about. You were nothing but an escape, a fantasy he indulged in when real life got too inconvenient." Margaret's gaze dropped, her fingers twisting in her lap. For a moment, neither woman spoke. The silence was thick, fraught with years of hidden emotions that had finally risen to the surface. Helen took a deep breath, her voice lowering to a steely calm. "I came here today to tell you this, Margaret. You may have been a part of his life, but you were never his life. He didn't choose you, and he never would have." A spark of defiance flashed in Margaret's eyes. "Maybe you're right, Helen. Maybe I was just part of his lie. But you're standing here, as broken by him as I am. So who's the real fool?" The words stung, striking Helen deeper than she expected. The reality settled over her like a heavy weight. She had been a fool, blinded by love, unable to see the cracks forming beneath her perfect marriage. And now, here she was, facing the other woman who'd shared that same blindness. As they sat in silence, a strange understanding passed between them. They both realized that, in the end, the real villain had been Thomas, a man who had taken from each of them without remorse, leaving them both shattered. The weight of that truth seemed to break something in Helen. Her anger faded, replaced by an overwhelming sadness. "You're right," Helen said quietly, looking down. "We both believed in something that never existed." Margaret's face softened, and for the first time, there was a glimmer of genuine sympathy. "I don't know how to make this right, Helen, but I am sorry." Helen nodded, accepting the apology. It didn't erase the pain, but it was a start. She rose to her feet, a sense of closure settling over her. She didn't need to linger in the shadow of her husband's lies any longer. She could finally let go. But just as she turned to leave, Margaret's voice stopped her. "There's something you should know," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "The last time I saw Thomas, he told me he was going to end things with you. He said he'd make a choice. And the next day, he was dead." Helen froze, her heart pounding as Margaret's words sank in. A realization swept over her, cold and unrelenting. Thomas's death hadn't been an accident. He'd been murdered. As Helen processed the implications, she turned back to Margaret, suspicion darkening her gaze. "Did you?" Margaret's face went pale, her eyes widening. "You think I killed him?" she whispered, horrified, but Helen couldn't answer. She was already walking away, her mind racing with questions. Had Margaret killed him out of desperation, when she realized he would never fully commit to her? Or had someone else, perhaps a business associate or even Thomas's own family, discovered his deceit? In that moment, Helen realized she might never know the full truth. But as she stepped out into the cold, fresh air, she felt a strange sense of freedom. The man who had bound them both in lies was gone, and now she could finally reclaim her life, one built on truth, even if that truth was shrouded in darkness. As she walked away from Margaret's house, Helen didn't look back.